Cargo Inspection Order. Double-check the manifest. This is CBP. But this time, it wasn't a random inspection. It wasn't the routine process where containers pass through the Port Newark Elizabeth Marine Terminal at 260 Doremus Ave, Newark, New Jersey. This was the starting point of another large-scale federal operation. But this time, the target wasn't fentanyl, and it wasn't foreign cartels. It was something far more dangerous, a vulnerability right in the heart of the United States' own port security system. It all began with a container from Guayaquil, Ecuador, declared as used agricultural equipment, an ordinary cheap type of cargo that rarely drew attention. But as it passed through the CBP scanner, the screen showed a dense steel mass, 3 times heavier than declared. The shape inside was sharp, uniform, nothing like any farming tool. And then the anomaly happened. The pre-clearance request for this container was approved in just 14 minutes, a speed that any experienced officer knows is impossible without intervention. ICE agents later confirmed that this irregularity could be linked to a sophisticated smuggling network that may have operated undetected for years. That network wasn't moving a few pounds of drugs, it was moving tons. Literally. A young, newly hired CBP officer discovered that the surveillance cameras in the container yard lost signal for exactly 18 minutes, right as the container left the dock. No technical report, just 18 minutes completely gone from the system, something that had never happened in a Tier 1 security zone. And then when agents checked the tracking system, they found the container had turned off GPS for 12 minutes and came back online in a completely different location, exactly 3.2 miles from the port, right next to the sprawling multi-acre property of Jonathan Hale himself, the port director of Newark, the man responsible for protecting the port, the man responsible for ensuring every container followed protocol, the man with the authority to edit manifests, reduce inspections, and prioritize cargo flows. And that suspicious container ended up right next to his house. Meanwhile, residential cameras captured a white truck pulling the container through the back gate of the estate, bypassing the main entrance, something that could only happen if someone inside wanted to avoid all eyes. The container seal had been broken. A broken seal means the container had been tampered with, and every security protocol had been violated. It didn't stop there. A FinCEN financial report revealed a $240,000 transfer into Jonathan Hale's account. The money was split into multiple transactions under $10,000, routed through Panama, Belize, routed finally into a U.S. Port Support Fund, an organization that doesn't exist. It was a money laundering pattern agents had seen in major cases. Break it down, hide it, legitimize it. But this time the account holder wasn't a cartel member. It was the head of the port. And that container, the 18 minutes of missing footage, the 12 minutes of disabled GPS, the illegally broken seal, was sitting on his property. This was no longer a technical glitch or operational mistake. This was the first sign that something much larger and darker was operating right beneath one of America's busiest ports. 4:52 a.m. Cold winds swept across the 18-acre property near the Port Newark Elizabeth Marine Terminal, while most of the city was still shrouded in darkness. But for the federal task force, this was the moment they closed the net around Jonathan Hale, the man in charge of port security, a man who had never been suspected until the trail led straight to his home. Hale, 54, had once been praised as a symbol of modern maritime security, the person who helped digitize thousands of manifests and restructure the container inspection system. But what he built had now become the perfect vehicle for a smuggling network, shielded by legitimate procedures. That was why 52 agents from the FBI, ICE, HSI, and DHS SRT moved in simultaneously on Hale's estate. No sirens, only footsteps calculated to the inch. Infrared drones scanned the grounds and immediately detected an unusual low heat signature, a tunnel running straight from behind the mansion, completely absent from any building records. The order came clear over the radio. Take the target. Safety first. The shout tore through the night. Federal warrant. Open the door. No response. The door flew open seconds later. When the breach team deployed the hydraulic ram, 2 suspects bolted from the hallway toward the basement, but were taken down cleanly by SRT agents on the cold tile floor. Hale was arrested in his office, the document shredder still running mid-cycle. He raised his hands without a word, his face ashen as agents read the charges. In the garage, investigators found the white truck still dusted with container residue. In the office, Hale's laptop showed system logs being manually deleted, and below, a steel door leading to the reinforced tunnel was breached with small explosive charges. The 170-meter tunnel led to a private warehouse outside Port Authority oversight. LED lights lined the ceiling. Internal cameras were active. Trolley wheel marks covered the floor. Everything indicated this route had been used repeatedly. Inside the storage area, agents seized 2.1 tons of contraband, pure cocaine, crystal meth, Handguns, automatic rifles, and stolen military-grade microchips routed through the very port Hale managed. That volume equaled half a year's supply for 3 major cartels. Impossible to move through the port without someone in Hale's position giving the green light. In the underground control room, they recovered an 11-year ledger, an internal server with edited manifests, and logs of deliberately disabled GPS. Every entry, every code, every disappeared container revealed a chilling truth. This wasn't the work of a small crew. This was a pipeline designed by the one person with the power to make it invisible. As agents cataloged evidence, the FBI team leader said only one thing: "What we're seeing here is just the outer layer. The rest, it's bigger, deeper, and far more dangerous." When the analysis team opened each recovered ledger from the tunnel, they immediately understood this wasn't a small-time operation, but the backbone of an empire that had operated quietly for over a decade. The pages were old, but the notes inside were as precise as a complete criminal ledger. In the most recent 30 months alone, 453 containers were marked as manifest adjusted. That number was too large to be coincidence. The altered manifests never listed dangerous items. They were replaced with harmless descriptions like mechanical parts, office equipment, or industrial fertilizer, cargo that didn't require deep scanning. When FBI cross-referenced these declarations with port systems, they uncovered something even more alarming. 27 port employees were directly involved, from low-level operators to area supervisors. They weren't professional criminals. They were people bought with cash, promises of promotion, or simply silenced. Digging deeper, investigators identified 3 ghost logistics companies that existed only on paper to provide legitimate cover for the smuggling flow. Analysis of shipment origins revealed a clear distribution structure. 40% came from Colombia, matching the pure cocaine seized in the tunnel. 35% originated in Mexico, consistent with the cartel standard crystal meth packaging. The remaining 25% came from Eastern Europe, containing weapons, stolen electronics, and sensitive microchips. The danger was that every shipment followed the same pattern, entered the port as clean containers, cleared through pre-clearance, routed directly to the estate via the tunnel, then dispersed inland through secondary hubs, meaning no real inspection ever touched these containers. Financially, the money laundering system uncovered on the internal server was equally sophisticated. Over 5 years, $11.3 million flowed through 6 countries: Panama, Belize, Cyprus, UAE, Kenya, and Luxembourg. Every transaction stayed under $10,000 to avoid reporting thresholds, but the frequency bore no resemblance to any legitimate business pattern. On most of the money ultimately landed in an entity called the U.S. Port Safety Fund, which sounded like a federal organization but didn't exist in IRS records. A shell used to launder dirty money before it returned to personal accounts. Jonathan Hale's role became clear with every line of data. He had pre-clearance authority, allowing him to bypass nearly all container inspection protocols. He could edit manifests before the system locked the data, and he could assign internal port routing, meaning he could direct containers to areas with the fewest cameras. Those 3 powers combined formed an absolute master key. No one in the port could run this network without his approval. And clearly, he didn't just approve. He was the center. As the investigation expanded beyond the state, FBI matched ledger transactions to activity in Houston, Long Beach, Newark, and Miami, the nation's highest volume international ports. 6 dark warehouses operated under fake companies in Nevada, Georgia, and Texas. The laundering patterns resembled Balkan groups, while the transport tactics matched Sinaloa cartel methods. This wasn't just a domestic ring. It was a link in a global criminal supply chain. The hardest blow came from a file on the server named Port Night Route Priority List. When decrypted, agents froze. It was a 7-year list of containers prioritized for nighttime clearance, marked with codes only a small insider group understood. Some containers were flagged differently, and when traced back, they contained components linked to foreign extremist organizations, including parts sufficient to build explosives or military-grade radio technology. At this point, the question was no longer who did this, but how far does this network reach? As the task force stood around the data boards, everyone understood one thing: this wasn't just corruption, smuggling, drugs, or weapons. This was a systematic penetration of U.S. security infrastructure from the inside, and it all started with one single incorrect manifest. One small error among thousands of daily data lines. But that error opened the door for the FBI to see an entire empire operating in the dark, right beneath America's feet. When evidence from the estate reached the Federal Analysis Center, the FBI and ICE knew the case couldn't stop at one 18-acre property. This wasn't an isolated ring. It was a branch of a network spanning the country. The next day, a nationwide operation was launched. Within 72 hours, federal teams in 6 states executed 29 search warrants simultaneously. From warehouses disguised as repair shops to ghost companies used to legitimize smuggling routes. The result: 32 suspects arrested, including 5 port supervisors, people who directly controlled container inspections. They had been trusted community members, federal uniform wearers every day, but in the paperwork and logs, their role was far greater. They were the links keeping the door open for contraband to flow inland. As the warehouses were sealed, the seizure totals left the entire team speechless. In the most recent 3 months alone, they recovered an additional 4.7 tons of cocaine, enough to paralyze large regions for years. Also seized 281 firearms, most with obliterated serial numbers, $1.2 million in cash, vacuum-sealed in bags, and over 200 sensitive microchips, usable in guided weapons or military jamming devices. Agents knew that if those chips reached hostile actors, the consequences wouldn't stay domestic. They could rise to national security threats. But the seizure numbers were only the surface of a much larger problem: the damage this network had already inflicted over years of operation. Drugs from those clean containers had seeped into school districts, where students were lured by pills disguised as prescription meds. They flooded communities, causing overdose emergency calls to spike. They reached hospitals, where patients thought they were taking legitimate painkillers. At the same time, weapons smuggled through this pipeline ended up with local gangs, fueling shootings that made only brief news mentions. And the stolen microchips had been traced to international hacker groups, creating cyber threats DHS had warned about but never sourced, until now. When the media released the arrested individuals' identities, the community reeled in shock. People couldn't believe the head of port security, the position seen as the first line of defense against smuggling, was the one paving the way for all these dangers. Port workers were shaken, fearing guilt by association, fearing stigma because of a few traitors. Labor unions immediately demanded an independent investigation, convinced the corruption couldn't stem from just one person. In closed-door meetings, federal leaders had to reassure the community that this wasn't a campaign against port employees. It was an effort to expose a system manipulated for years. But then the truth about systemic failure began to emerge. Internal records showed no independent audits of nighttime priority cargo flows for 7 years. Risk reports submitted by lower-level staff had been softened before reaching DHS, and during that time, hundreds of containers passed through unquestioned, partly because people trusted the process, partly because that trust was deliberately exploited. In the federal interrogation room, Hale sat across from agents in complete silence. 41 minutes passed, denial, no visible fear, and then he said only one sentence, in a flat, cold voice. "You have no idea how big the system really is." That wasn't a defense. It was a warning. A larger system, a network of which he was only a small part, a structure quietly operating behind the scenes, involving people who never appeared in any report. As agents left the interrogation room, no one felt the case was closed. They had the arrests, they had the seizures, but everyone knew what had been exposed was only the surface layer, the layer the orchestrators allowed to be seen, because they believed no one could dig deeper. When the dust from the raids settled and the flashing lights faded, the sounds that lingered weren't the click of handcuffs or the sealing of crates. They were the voices of people who had never appeared in any report. A young port worker who had believed in the system as firmly as he believed in the steel structure of the docks, told a reporter, still reeling, "We thought our leadership was protecting us. Turns out he was the one opening the door to the danger." He didn't cry, but his red eyes weren't from fear, they were from betrayal. People like him, who trusted procedures, trusted superiors, believed the containers passing daily served the nation's interest, now had to live with the question, what had they unknowingly touched? For victims' families, the aftermath was even heavier. The mother of a dock worker shot in a local gang dispute involving weapons from this very pipeline said through tears, "We didn't know the gun that killed my son came from the port where he worked." That statement needed no explanation. A ton of seized contraband can be burned, sealed, or shipped away. But that kind of loss has nowhere to go. When the network was exposed, ICE, DHS, and FBI leaders stood before the press and delivered words they knew wouldn't comfort anyone. "We stopped one link, not the entire system." Another official added, "This network isn't everything." The statements were short, clear, cold, like the reality they faced. Because anyone with nerves intact understood that more than 2.1 tons of contraband couldn't move through layers of controls, checkpoints, electronic manifests, and identification scans on its own. It required an entire apparatus, people looking away, turning their backs, or actively participating. And the questions began echoing in community meetings. How many other ports have been infiltrated? How many estates, warehouses, ghost companies are hiding behind legitimate covers? How many other manifests are being altered in the same handwriting? But the biggest question was the moral one, the one that made this investigation different. If the person holding the keys is the one opening the door to crime, then what other places are rotting that we haven't dared to examine? That wasn't just a question about one individual. It was a question about trust in the system, about vulnerabilities we accept because we think it'll be fine, about ignored risk reports, about procedures loosened out of habit that became gateways for things no one imagined. When the final evidence was boxed and transferred to federal storage, no one on the investigation team felt the relief of a finished job. Instead, they felt like people who had just seen the bottom of one abyss, only to realize there was another abyss below. And like every major investigation, the end of this chapter wasn't a period. It was a heavy comma. If you believe the truth shouldn't be buried, like and share. This story isn't over. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts of this investigative series. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.